My name is Edith Moreau, and I wasn't supposed to know what they were doing. I wasn't supposed to understand the digital forms, the online documents, or the new way of flipping houses like trading cards. I was just supposed to smile, nod, and eventually die quietly so they could move on. But I was born in a time when people read things carefully. I worked 30 years in the county registrar's office, where we filed titles, scanned deeds, and notarized trusts. I saw entire families fall apart over a missing signature, over a date misfiled, over a will left unsigned. So when my daughter-in-law Julie started treating me like the furniture in the home my father built brick by brick, I knew something was coming. It started slowly, a skipped greeting, a roll of the eyes. And then one day she brought a realtor to brunch. "I just thought we could look around," she said while pouring herself orange juice from the crystal carafe my late husband had given me. "Just for fun." I nodded politely as I always did. But something shifted. She used the word "our house." That small word "our" landed like an alarm in my chest. My son Anthony didn't say much. He never did when Julie was around. She filled every room with her ideas and her confidence, and he just followed, trailing behind her like a balloon tied to her wrist. I wasn't blind. I wasn't helpless. And I certainly wasn't stupid. But I had learned long ago that rage gives people the excuse they want to ignore you. So I said nothing. Not yet. The house we lived in was my inheritance from my father, a Navy officer who built this home in 1953 after returning from war. It was placed in a living trust when he passed with my name as the irrevocable beneficiary. But Julie had never asked about that. She assumed, like most people do, that because I was old, I was also out of the loop. She started moving things. My antique desk gone. The floral china I kept for Easter boxed away. Even my father's medals disappeared from the hallway, replaced by abstract art I didn't recognize. "We're just refreshing things," she said, smiling like a politician. "It's still your home, of course." Of course. I spent the next 2 weeks going through my documents. I opened the fireproof box in my closet, still locked with the tiny brass key I kept pinned to my bra strap. Inside was the original deed from my father. The trust transfer, the notary stamps, the original title history, all still intact. All still mine. But the thing Julie never learned, because no one had taught her, and she never thought to ask, was that the house could not be sold without my explicit signature. It wasn't just a name on a page. It was a trust-protected title layered with clauses and legal roots too deep for her to cut through. That's when I knew I wasn't going to stop her. I was going to let her walk into her own trap. I began writing everything down. The dates she brought the realtor, the time she gave tours when I was away at my book club, the days she called a local stager to spruce up the place. One afternoon, she stood in the front yard with a young couple, waving her arms around the garden my father had once planted with his bare hands. "We've had it in the family for years," she said. But she said, "We, not my mother-in-law." That evening, I found a slip of paper on the hallway table. An offer letter. Signed. Pending my approval. Julie didn't say a word. She simply nodded at me as she walked into the kitchen. I took the letter into my room, folded it neatly, and placed it next to the trust agreement just under the clause that read, "This property may not be conveyed, transferred, or sold without the direct notarized consent of Edith Moreau, the named lifetime beneficiary." I made a copy and mailed it to myself. It sounds old-fashioned, but I know the power of a sealed, time-stamped envelope. You don't spend 3 decades in the public records office without learning that paper is the last weapon of the honest. And then I waited. Julie thought she was outsmarting me. I let her think that, because some battles don't need shouting. Some wars are won by silence, precision, and timing. So before you sit down and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Because what's coming next? You might actually regret missing it. Julie became a whirlwind after the offer came in. She hosted private showings when I was out. She began rearranging furniture I'd kept in place for 50 years. One afternoon, I came home to find the old grandfather clock, the one my father had repaired with his own tools, shoved behind a curtain. "It's too dated," she said. "We're going for a modern vibe." I watched her bubble wrap the memories I had lived. Watched her reduce rooms into bullet points for prospective buyers. But I didn't stop her. She thought I was grieving quietly, shrinking into a shell of nostalgia. She mistook my silence for helplessness, my age for irrelevance. What she didn't realize is that silence, when wielded intentionally, becomes a blade. My son Anthony tried to reassure me. "She's just excited, Mom," he said one night. "We're all in transition. You'll love the new place once we find it. Closer to the city. Fewer stairs." He patted my hand like I was a fragile thing. I looked into his eyes and saw the boy who used to bring me crayon drawings. The man I raised to be fair, and for a moment I felt a deep pang, not of betrayal, but of loss. Julie had become the voice of their home, and I had become its shadow. Still, I smiled and said nothing, because I knew what was coming. The next morning, I went to the courthouse. I parked in the same spot I had for 3 decades, walked through the familiar halls where my shoes echoed against memories, and greeted the clerk at the records window like I had never left. "I need to pull up a property file," I said. "Parcelle patron 7B. She smiled. "Still sharp, Mrs. Moreau." "I try." She slid the manila folder across the counter. Everything was still in place. The trust was intact. The title had not changed. No sale had been recorded. But the buyer's offer, it was already signed by Julie. She'd bypassed me entirely, assuming, like so many, that a signature could be forged, or that power of attorney could be waved like a wand. I made copies of the trust and attached a note. "Pending transfer invalid without original trustee's notarized approval." I stamped it, filed it, photocopied it, then mailed one to the listing agent, another to the escrow office. I didn't call Julie. I didn't confront her. Instead, I made tea. I sat in my garden, and I waited. Days passed, then a week, then 2. One morning, Julie stormed into the kitchen, red in the face, a stack of papers in her hand. "What did you do?" she hissed. "I made tea," I replied calmly, sipping from my porcelain cup. "Would you like some?" "This sale is falling apart. The title company says you blocked it. You're not even the owner." I smiled, soft and dangerous. "Oh, I'm not the owner," I said. "Well, we'd better double-check, because I believe the original trust and the county say otherwise." She looked like she had swallowed a pin. Her hands shook. Her mouth opened and closed twice before she found words. "You didn't say anything. You let me go through all this." "I did." "You let me get an offer." "I did." "You let me stage everything." "You let me—" "I did," I said again, because sometimes the only way to show someone how little they know is to let them finish the sentence. She backed away, her fury clashing against something colder in the room, something she hadn't expected. Composure. The power of being right without having to prove it. Anthony came home later that evening. He was quiet. "I thought you were okay with it," he said. "I was okay with living here," I replied. "I still am." She didn't know. She didn't ask. We sat in silence. I just wanted her to feel like she had a place. And did she? He didn't answer. Julie stopped speaking to me after that. She moved through the house like a ghost, shamed not by screaming, but by the weight of her own assumptions. They didn't apologize. People like Julie rarely do, but I didn't need her apology. I had the house. I had the law. I had the truth. And the house. It stayed exactly where it was, every brick of it. The title never moved. Just like me. Julie may have stopped speaking to me, but her presence in the house became louder in a different way. Silence, after all, is not absence. It's tension. It's the hiss of an unsent email. It's the clatter of dishes set down too hard. It's the way a woman like Julie made her passive aggression an art form. She didn't yell. She just moved things. My books disappeared from the living room shelf, replaced with coffee table magazines with titles like Modern Wealth and Clean Lines. The Art of Less. My gardening gloves vanished from the back porch drawer. My late husband's pipe rack gone. "It was old," she said when I asked. "Yes," I said softly. "So am I?" Anthony did his best to float above the friction. He worked long hours and spent evenings glued to his phone. He thought, like many men do, that silence was peace. That if no one screamed, everything was fine. But some things do not break loudly. They decay. They crumble behind drywall, behind civility, behind words never said. And what Julie didn't know, what she never even imagined, is that beneath her curated minimalism, beneath her assumptions, she had already walked into a trap she built for herself. It was around that time I remembered something else, something I had almost forgotten. Back in 1979, after my father passed and left me the house, he had added a specific clause to the trust. A clause that most people would miss if they weren't trained to read legal filings the way I was. It read, "In the event that the beneficiary is ever made to vacate the premises against her will or under duress ownership, shall revert fully and permanently to the next named heir, excluding any spouse of a descendant who is found complicit." It was bold, even harsh. But my father knew what it meant to fight for what you believed in. He had crossed oceans, seen brothers die in uniform. And he always said, "Edie, never let a fool with confidence talk you out of your rights." Julie was trying to erase me, not just from the house but from the story. She wanted to be the woman who turned a dusty old property into a hot new listing. She wanted to be seen as the family matriarch. Never mind, the actual one was still alive, still lucid and still holding the documents she never asked to see. One morning, I found a suitcase outside my bedroom door. "I think it's time you took a break," Julie said lightly. "We've booked you a room at the Cedar Grove Care Retreat. Just for a little while we finish the staging." I stared at her, stunned not by the action but by the confidence. She really believed she could do this. Like I was a pet she could board. Like I was a doormat with no memory of how the door was built. I picked up the suitcase, opened it, and removed one item. A silk scarf I had worn to my husband's funeral. I folded it over my arm and said, "Julie, do you know what a reversion clause is?" She blinked. "What?" I didn't think so. I walked past her, into my study, and opened the fireproof box again. I made one final copy of the trust highlighted. Then I called a notary. Then my old friend Mabel from the records office. And finally a legal mediator I'd worked with back in 2003. By that afternoon, the clause was registered recertified. The county had a timestamp. The escrow company had a letter. And I had my trap sealed with a ribbon of law. Julie had stepped over the line. And now, the deed no longer mattered. The house was protected. The trust was activated. She had forced the hand of the man who built this home, and he reached from the grave to slap hers away. I didn't yell. I didn't fight. I just filed the truth. With precision. 2 days after the suitcase incident, a white envelope arrived in the mailbox addressed to me in a neat, unfamiliar hand. Inside, a formal letter from the title agency. At the top in bold were the words, "Escrow suspended. Beneficiary signature required." Julie's plans were no longer just interrupted, they were unraveling. I heard her pacing upstairs, talking loudly into her phone, the kind of volume people use when they want others to overhear their importance. Every few minutes she'd shout things like, "I don't understand," or "She wasn't supposed to block it." I sipped my chamomile tea by the window, watching the breeze move through the roses my husband once planted. Their roots were old, unmoving, like mine. The silence downstairs was eventually broken when Anthony stepped into the kitchen. "Mom," he said, avoiding my eyes. "Julie's upset. I imagine she is. She says you're sabotaging things. That you filed something to kill the sale." I looked at him, letting the silence stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable. "I filed the truth," I said. "I filed what's always been there. The trust, the clause, the ownership. If you're surprised, it's only because no one bothered to ask." He exhaled and ran a hand through his thinning hair. "I thought we were all on the same page." "No, Anthony." She wrote the page. "You just signed your name to it." He sat down across from me. His face was tired, his voice lower. "She said you'd agreed to move out. That you were ready." Did I say that? Well, no, not directly. But then you assumed, like she did. I walked to the old cabinet and retrieved the original title document, the one with my father's signature and seal. I placed it gently in front of him. "You want to know what I agreed to?" "I agreed to protect this home. I agreed to honor what was left for me. And now I'm doing that." He didn't touch the paper, just stared at it. Outside, the wind shifted. Inside, something else did too. That evening, I heard the car doors slam. Julie left for her mother's house across town, dragging 2 suitcases behind her. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't look back. And I didn't ask her to. 3 days later, a notice appeared in the local newspaper. "Pending sale withdrawn. Title complication. I clipped it and tucked it in my journal right next to the photo of my father in uniform and a note he once wrote. Protect what matters. Quietly if you can. Loudly if you must. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt still. The chaos had gone. The house breathed again. In the days that followed, I moved my books back to the living room. I polished the grandfather clock. I retrieved my gardening gloves from the trash bin. And I opened the windows wide. There was one more thing to do. Something final. Julie had signed legal documents pretending to act on my behalf. That wasn't just arrogance, it was fraud. I contacted a real estate attorney, not to sue. I wasn't after money or revenge in the legal sense. I just wanted the record corrected. Her name was removed from any correspondence with escrow. Her authorization revoked. A formal complaint was lodged with the real estate board. She had to attend a hearing. I didn't go, but I did send a notarized letter enclosing copies of the trust and title. I included a postscript in my own hand. She tried to sell something she never owned. Fortunately, some of us still read the fine print. Julie never responded. Anthony tried to make peace. He brought flowers one Sunday. We had tea. We didn't mention her name. He didn't ask to move back in. I didn't offer. Some things don't need to be said aloud. Some truths live in the walls, in the papers, in the old pipes of a home that has seen too much to ever forget. A week passed. Then another. The house grew quieter, but it wasn't lonely. It was breathing again, settling into its natural rhythm, free from the anxious pacing of someone trying to repurpose it like a Pinterest project. I could hear the creak of the floorboards again, the gentle hum of the old refrigerator, even the familiar echo of my steps returning from the hallway. I began pulling out old journals I hadn't read in years. Letters from my father, pressed flowers from the rose garden recipes written in my late husband's neat cursive. Then I found it. Tucked inside the pages of a gardening almanac from 1982 was a letter I had completely forgotten existed. It was from my father, written 2 months before he passed. The envelope was unsealed, aged, and yellowed, but the words inside were clear. Dear Edie, I know what kind of world you're walking into without me. Men will underestimate you. Women will envy you. And family, well, family will confuse your kindness for weakness. This house is more than wood and brick. It is a symbol of memory, of trust, of legacy. Don't let anyone, no matter how charming or clever, ever tell you that you're in the way. You are the cornerstone. And if they ever try to remove you, let the house remind them whose name still holds the deed. With love, Dad. I cried then, not from sadness but from validation. My father had seen it all before it happened, and somehow, even from the past, he had left me one more lifeline. It wasn't just about the house. It was about what it represented. That older women are not disposable. That history matters. That memory is worth defending. Later that week, I went into town to drop off some old records at the archive office. I ran into Mabel, my former colleague. I heard about the mess, she said gently. Word gets around, huh? Fastest thing in a small town, she winked. Then leaned in and added, You always did file better than anyone. We laughed. But behind her eyes, I saw the same thing I'd felt myself: weariness. The burden women like us carry after being ignored, dismissed, or walked over for decades. You ever feel like we were trained for battles they didn't know they were waging? I asked. Every day, she said, and thank God we were. When I returned home, I made a copy of my father's letter and placed it in the fireproof box alongside the trust, a kind of legacy vault. I didn't know if Anthony would ever truly understand. He called occasionally now, always sounding tired, always alone. Julie was staying with her mother. She hadn't come back. And then, one day, a courier dropped off a package for me. No return address. Inside, a crisp folder embossed with silver lettering, Walker, Hayes and Finch, family estate lawyers. My stomach turned. I opened it slowly and found a single sheet of paper. Julie had filed a petition challenging the clause in the trust, arguing that my mental faculties were in decline and that the sale delay was harming the family's financial security. She had attached no medical reports, no testimony, just her word. But in my world, just your word doesn't go far without evidence. I called Walker Hayes myself, spoke to one of the partners. Yes, he said, flipping through something. Actually, close the file. Once we saw your trust documentation and title history, we advised your daughter-in-law to withdraw. So the petition, dismissed, formally. And the reason, legal title notarized trust consistent mental competency. And, he chuckled, you once co-authored a training handbook for the county registrar's office, didn't you? I did. Well, that settled it. I hung up, sat down, took a long breath. Julie had tried one last desperate move, an ugly one. But this wasn't her game. This was mine. The house sat in the sun as if nothing had happened, as if it knew all along it wouldn't be leaving. The flowers bloomed. The chimney bricks warmed in the afternoon light. Some things do not move. Some truths cannot be erased. And some women are not as fragile as they appear. The last formal blow had been struck, and still Julie didn't stop. Though her legal petition was dismissed, the damage she tried to do lingered in the air like a smoke that clung to the curtains. There was no apology, no call, no note, just silence. Her most consistent skill. I thought of sending her a letter, something simple, polite, a closure of sorts. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized people like Julie don't understand letters. They understand headlines. And so I made one. I reached out to the local newspaper, the Mill Creek Gazette. I'd worked with their editor years ago during a public records update campaign. I asked if they were still running their Generations series, profiles on families preserving old homes in our town. He said yes. I said I had a story. We did the interview in my backyard beside the roses with the house standing tall behind me, just like it had for 70 years. The photographer snapped pictures of the kitchen wallpaper my mother had chosen in 1962, the fire pit my husband built, and the wooden gate I had repainted every spring since 1980. The headline ran 2 Sundays later. She inherited more than a house. Edith Moreau and the legacy of quiet strength. I left a copy folded neatly on the foyer bench. I didn't care whether Julie ever saw it. But I knew someone would tell her. And that was enough. Anthony came by that evening. He didn't mention the article. Instead, he handed me something I hadn't expected. A box. Inside was my missing china set packed poorly but all intact. I found it in the garage, he said softly. She was going to sell it. I held the lid for a moment, then slowly closed the box. Thank you, I said. That was a gift from my mother on my wedding day. I didn't know. No, I said. You didn't. He hesitated, then asked, would it be all right if I came by next week? Maybe helped in the garden. I didn't smile, but I nodded. There's a kind of forgiveness that doesn't need words. It needs consistency. It needs effort. Julie had tried to erase me, but her hand was clumsy. She didn't realize that real power lives in the infrastructure, in the foundations, the footnotes, the women who file quietly and remember everything. And then came the day I saw her again. It was at the grocery store aisle 3 right by the baking flour. She looked thinner, tired. Her lipstick was smeared like she'd applied it in a rush, or maybe in a car mirror. She didn't see me at first, but when she turned, our eyes locked. Her hands clenched around the shopping basket. She opened her mouth, then closed it. I stepped forward not to attack, just to exist, fully, calmly. She glanced down. Edith. I saw the petition, I said before she could continue. And the real estate listing. And the paperwork. I didn't mean for it to go that far. I just thought it would be good for the family. Family, I repeated. Isn't something you bulldoze to feel powerful? She winced. I just thought you'd want to live somewhere easier. This house never became hard to live in, I said. It only became hard when you did. Julie lowered her gaze. There was nothing more to say. She turned and walked toward the checkout without another word. And me. I picked up my flour paid and went home. I baked a pie that afternoon. Lemon custard. My favorite. I sat on the back porch with a slice and a cup of coffee, staring out over the yard my father once mowed. Sometimes power isn't about holding on. Sometimes it's about holding still. This house, the very one she tried to steal, had protected me in more ways than one. It was a shield, a memory, a last will and testament of the women who came before me. And as the wind rustled the hedges, I whispered aloud, "Thank you, Dad. You knew she was coming, even before I did." Summer came early that year. The roses bloomed ahead of schedule just like they did the year after my husband passed, when time seemed to rebel, rushing forward whether I was ready or not. The house stood unchanged. But I was changing, slowly, quietly. Not into someone new, but into someone remembered. I began receiving letters after the newspaper article. Neighbors I hadn't heard from in years sent kind notes. One woman, Janice Cole from down the street, wrote, "Edith, I always knew you were the quiet spine of this neighborhood. Thank you for reminding us we're still allowed to stand up straight." That one made me cry. Another came from a young woman I'd never met. Her mother had read the piece and shared it with her. "I'm 31. I've spent my life being told to not make a fuss, to move out of the way, to stay pleasant and small. Your story reminded me that protecting what's ours isn't selfish, it's sacred." Thank you. I pinned that letter to my corkboard. It reminded me that legacy doesn't always pass through blood. Sometimes it travels through courage, through quiet acts of resistance, through knowing when not to move. Then one morning, as I was pruning the hydrangeas, Anthony arrived again. But this time, he wasn't alone. He had our granddaughter with him, Lily, all of 8 years old, bounding through the garden with bare feet and a handful of dandelions. "Grandma Edith," she shouted, "I brought you a weed bouquet." I laughed, honest and full. "The best kind." We sat together on the steps while Anthony trimmed some overgrown hedges. I noticed how he worked not expertly but gently, carefully. Maybe he was learning. Maybe he was trying. Lily asked me about the house. "How old is it?" she wondered. "Older than your daddy," I said. Her eyes widened. "Older than the moon." "Not quite, but close." She giggled and leaned against me, and in that moment I felt something shift. Not in the house, not in the garden, but in me. The wound. Julie had left the wound Anthony had widened with his silence. It wasn't gone, but it was no longer raw. It had scarred, strong and smooth. I told Lily about the man who built the house, her great-grandfather. I showed her the old oak tree where I buried a time capsule as a child, and she asked if we could dig it up. I said yes. We spent the rest of the day searching, with a small garden spade laughter echoing across the yard that had once felt like a battlefield. Later, when they left, Anthony lingered at the door. "I'm sorry," he said finally, "for not asking, for not knowing." I nodded. That's the start of something, I told him. He didn't press, just nodded too, and walked to his car. I stood at the window after they left, watching the dust trail behind their tires fade into the distance. The house felt full again, not because someone was moving in, but because something broken had begun to mend. That evening, I sat at my desk and wrote a new letter. Not to a lawyer, not to the paper, to Lily. I didn't intend to give it to her now, maybe not for years, but I wanted her to have it someday, when she was old enough to know what a trust means. What a title means. What it means to stand your ground, even if the ground is your front porch. Dear Lily, one day someone might try to convince you that your place in the world is negotiable, that if you stay quiet, things will be easier. That legacy is too complicated. That trust can be broken. Don't believe them. Not because you're angry, not because you need to prove them wrong, but because you know who you are and who came before you. Love, Grandma Edith. I folded the letter, slipped it into an envelope, and placed it beside the fireproof box. Someday she would find it, and she would understand. The quiet woman in the old house wasn't quiet because she had nothing to say. She was quiet because she was waiting, watching for the moment that mattered. And when it came, she was ready. The first autumn after the failed sale was somehow the most peaceful season I'd experienced in years. There were no contractors stomping through the hallway, no staging professionals replacing curtains with cleaner lines, and no Julie measuring rooms with her phone while humming some lifestyle blogger's playlist. There was only me, and the sound of leaves returning to earth. The fireplace cracked gently in the evenings. I started keeping a pot of cinnamon cider on the stove, its scent drifting through the house like memory. There's a stillness in autumn that feels almost sacred when you're older, when you've fought and endured, and still remained rooted in the place they tried to cut you from. And then, just when I thought I had heard the last of Julie, she returned. Not in person, but through an envelope. A letter, handwritten, slanted, Emotional. Edith. I can't say I'm proud of what I did. I thought I was helping. I thought simplifying the family's future meant taking over, taking control. You made me look foolish. But the truth is, I was foolish long before you exposed it. I didn't understand what the house meant. I only saw what I wanted it to be. You're not the one in the way. I'm sorry, Julie. It was folded tightly like she had hesitated even as she sealed it. I sat with it for a long time, unsure whether to feel satisfaction or sorrow. The apology had come too late for repair, but perhaps not too late for release. I didn't write her back. Some apologies don't require a reply. They require endurance. I placed the letter in my file cabinet behind a folder labeled Personal Affairs. I didn't need it, but I didn't throw it away either. Maybe one day Lily would find it and understand what her grandmother chose to hold and to let go. And yet, even as the leaves fell and peace settled like a blanket across the neighborhood, something curious happened. A young couple moved in across the street, Ryan and Marisol. Early 30s. Idealistic. Warm. They brought me cookies during their first week. Mrs. Moreau. Ryan said, "We heard you've been here the longest. We want to hear your stories." Most people don't ask older women for stories anymore. They want summaries, bullet points, brief anecdotes before returning to their screens. But they sat with me, listened. I told them about the hydrangeas that never bloomed the same 2 years in a row, about my father's return from the Pacific War, about my husband painting the porch ceiling sky blue because his mother said it would keep the ghosts out. Marisol cried when I told her how I fought for the house. "That's the kind of story I want to pass down," she said. "A woman who didn't shout but who stayed." They asked me something else, too. "Would you mind," Ryan said, "if we interviewed you for our podcast?" It's about heritage, voice, memory. I was hesitant at first. But then I thought, why not? They recorded in my study, the same room where Julie once stood with a suitcase and a smirk. Now there was a microphone. And my voice. I spoke not for vengeance, but for remembrance. I told them, "You don't preserve a home by defending the walls. You preserve it by honoring the soul within it. And if you're lucky enough to be the one holding the key, you'd better know whose hands built the lock." When they published the episode, something surprising happened. People started reaching out, strangers from towns I'd never heard of. A woman from Vermont wrote, "Your words helped me stand my ground when my brother tried to force sell our parents' farm." Another from Arizona, "I played your voice for my granddaughter. She said, 'I want to be like that lady when I grow up.'" I never expected to become a voice for others. But perhaps staying silent all those years gave my voice more weight when I finally chose to use it. One evening, just as the sun folded itself into the horizon, I lit a candle in the front window. Not for anyone in particular, just for all of us who stayed when they tried to push us out. All of us who read the fine print. All of us who refused to be erased. And in that glow, I saw it clearly. This house hadn't been saved. It had simply remained what it always was, mine. It was a gray November morning when I decided to file one final document. Not for defense, not for retaliation, for clarity. I had long kept the original trust, the notarized title, and the reversion clause secure in my fireproof box. But I knew as years moved forward and memories grew hazy, it would benefit someone, maybe Lily, maybe Anthony, maybe even the courts, to see everything lined up in one coherent, undeniable package. So I drafted what's known as a restatement of intent. It's not a new trust. It doesn't alter the original, but it reiterates in plain language why the house exists the way it does and who it was meant for. I titled it, "The House That Built Me, A Declaration of Custody and Continuity." The clerk at the registrar's office looked at the document and raised her eyebrows. "This is beautifully written," she said. "I've had time," I smiled. She scanned the paperwork, stamped it, and handed me a certified copy. "It's official," she said. "No one can touch it now." But they never really could. Not legally. Only emotionally. Only through assumptions and pressure and the underhanded tactic of pretending my presence was negotiable. As I walked out of the courthouse, I felt a lightness in my chest I hadn't known in years. It wasn't just relief, it was release. I passed the old oak tree on the edge of the courthouse lawn, the same one my husband and I used to picnic under when we were young, I stopped, closed my eyes, and let the memory return. His laughter, my straw hat blowing away, the way he looked at me like I was made of iron and light. I whispered to the air, "I finished it, Henry." And I had. That evening, I invited Anthony over, not for tea, but for something more permanent. I handed him the certified restatement. "I want you to hold on to this," I said. He looked confused. "You're changing the trust." "No," I said firmly. "I'm clarifying it. For you. For Lily. For whoever comes after, so no one ever has to go through this again." He turned the page, skimming the paragraphs. His hand slowed at the part where I described how the house had become my armor, how being nearly erased had taught me to write my presence in bold. "Mom," he said softly, "you didn't have to go through all of this alone." "But I did," I replied, "because no one stood up until it was over." He closed the folder. "I'm standing now." I believed him. Later, after he left, I sat on the front steps in the quiet twilight. The wind was still, the garden was sleeping, and the house loomed behind me like a monument to every quiet victory I had carved from stone. And that's when I saw her, Julie, across the street, standing outside her mother's car. She had driven by slowly, then stopped. She didn't get out. She just stood there, watching. I didn't wave. I didn't go inside. I stayed seated, my back straight, my chin high, framed by the house she thought she could claim. She looked away first, and that was enough. She drove off without ever rolling down the window. Some people never understand the damage they've done, and some people do, but too late to undo it. I went inside, locked the front door, and ran my hand over the wood grain like greeting an old friend. In the kitchen, I pulled out my recipe tin, flipped to the back, and found the old recipe for my grandmother's almond cake. It felt right to bake it again for the first time in years. Not for a holiday, not for guests, just for me, for the woman who stayed, for the woman who filed the right form, because that's how legacies are protected. Not with shouting, not with war, with knowledge, with truth, with one woman quietly putting her name where it always belonged. A few weeks later, the wind carried winter into town like an old friend with sharp elbows. The first snow came soft and slow, frosting the front steps and blanketing the hedges with quiet. I always found comfort in snow, the way it equalized everything. Rich roofs, poor ones, gardens left wild, and those kept pristine. Snow didn't care. It covered everything with the same gentle silence. I made a fresh pot of coffee and sat by the bay window, wrapped in the thick wool shawl my mother knitted decades ago. The house creaked softly in its bones, the old radiator humming in defiance of the cold. And then came the knock. 3 short raps on the front door, measured, nervous. I opened it, and there stood Julie. Her coat was too thin for the weather, her cheeks pink from the wind, and in her gloved hands was a manila envelope. She looked older, not in age but in weight, like she had been carrying something heavy and only now realized she couldn't keep dragging it through life. "I'm not here to fight," she said quietly. "Then don't," I replied, holding the door just wide enough for conversation but not for entry. She nodded, eyes darting to the floor. Then she held out the envelope. "I found some things I think belong to you. Photos, your sewing box. Some letters I didn't think were important at the time. I kept them. I'm sorry." I took the envelope without a word. She looked up at me, then not defiant, not entitled, just human. "I read the article," she said, "and I heard the podcast." I raised an eyebrow. "You were graceful," she added, "even when you didn't have to be." I studied her. The woman who had tried to sell my life out from under me, who had tried to rewrite history with a digital form and a smile. And yet now she stood in the cold, offering back fragments of the past she had once tried to discard. "I didn't do it for grace," I said. "I did it for truth and survival. You wanted to be seen. So did I. The difference is I didn't erase someone else to be visible." Her lips parted slightly, but she didn't speak. Her breath came in slow puffs of steam. "You thought I was in the way," I continued. "But you were standing in front of something far older than either of us. You didn't inherit this house. You invaded it." She flinched, just slightly, then nodded. "I know that now," she whispered. "I was trying to build something of my own, and I thought taking control would give me power. But it didn't. It gave me emptiness." She glanced up. I lost Anthony. I held her gaze. No, I said. You gave him away. One bad idea at a time. Julie blinked rapidly, her shoulders trembling not from the cold, but from something breaking inside. I don't expect forgiveness, she said. But I did want to return what was yours. Then that's all you needed to do. She turned to leave, pausing at the first step. Goodbye, Edith. And this time I let her go. Not with anger. Not with bitterness. With finality. Inside, I opened the envelope. Old photos fell out me in the garden with Anthony as a toddler, my husband on a ladder stringing up Christmas lights, my father holding a newborn Lily in a patch of summer sunlight. The sewing box was there too, and in it folded in four was a note I had written to myself when I turned 60. You are still building, even now, with every word you do not say, with every truth you quietly guard. With every time you let them underestimate you and then prove them wrong by simply enduring. I ran my fingers across the words. I had forgotten that I once needed those lines. That I had written them as armor. Now, I no longer needed them, but I was glad they had stayed. I returned the sewing box to its place, taped the old family photos back into the hallway collage Julie had once torn down. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I wrote Christmas cards. To Mabel, to Ryan and Marisol, to the postwoman who always waved, even to the editor of the Gazette. And at the bottom of each card in small script I added the same closing line. Thank you for remembering I was still here. Because sometimes that's all any of us want. Not to be celebrated, but to be seen. To remain. By the time January arrived, the house had settled into its old rhythms again. The wind knocked gently at the windows like a friend checking in. The pipes groaned in the walls, complaining softly like elders at a family dinner. I had lived in this house for so many decades that even its smallest sounds had meaning. They weren't interruptions. They were language. That month, I started something new. I began writing my history, not a memoir, but a living document. A record of who lived here, of what was planted and what was preserved. A record for Lily, for her children, and for anyone who might one day walk its floors and wonder whose footsteps came before. I called it The House That Watched Me Grow. Each page began with a date and a single sentence of memory. May 12, 1973. Henry replaced the screen door and told me my laugh was louder than the hinges. October 1st, 1989. Anthony carved his name into the baseboard with a fork. I never fixed it. Simple things. True things. Evidence of life. I wasn't writing to preserve vanity. I was writing to preserve humanity. One afternoon, I heard the mailbox clatter and found an envelope addressed in familiar handwriting. Anthony's. Inside was a single photograph newly printed. Lily stood in front of a school poster titled My Family's Hero. And there, next to a crayon drawing of a house with roses and an old woman on the steps she had written. My grandma Edith is my hero because she kept our home safe with papers and bravery. I stared at the page for a long time. No medals, no speeches, no headlines. Just the truth of a child, untainted, direct, and bright as snowfall. That evening, Anthony called. His voice was calm, softer than usual. Lily's been asking about the house, he said. She wants to know how it stayed yours. Because I never let it stop being mine, I replied. She wants to visit again. Just her and me, if that's okay. Of course. There was a pause, long and loaded. Then, Julie and I are separated. It's been coming for a while. Your house wasn't the cause, Mom. It just exposed what was already cracking. I didn't respond with sympathy. I responded with something deeper. I hope I said slowly that what breaks gives you space to rebuild the right things. I think it will, he said. I want to help document the house. For Lily. For the future. That weekend they came. Lily had her notebook. Anthony brought a digital recorder. And I brought out the old tin of family photos, some of them curling at the edges like autumn leaves. We sat in the living room, the three of us surrounded by time. I told stories. Lily asked questions. Anthony listened. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was return. That night after they left, I walked through the house room by room. I touched the banister my father sanded. The bedroom door Henry had installed when Anthony turned 10. The kitchen counter where Julie once whispered that I was out of place. And yet I was still here. Not a shadow, not a relic, but a woman, a matriarch, a record keeper of truth. There was one last thing to do. I returned to my writing desk and pulled out a small box. Inside was a copy of my will newly updated. It assigned Anthony as executor, but more importantly, it included a letter of instruction. This home is to remain in the family under the stewardship of those who value its memory above its market value. If Lily chooses to live here one day, tell her the soil still knows my hands. Tell her this house isn't made of wood and glass, it's made of choices. I signed it with steady hand. Then I turned off the lights. The hallway lamp, the only glow remaining. I stood in the center of the living room and whispered aloud. I remained, not as a guest, not as a burden, but as a foundation. Some women leave legacies in children or titles. I left mine in the structure they tried to sell, but never owned. The following spring arrived like an apology. It was as if the world itself had taken note of the battles I had weathered and decided to send a peace offering in return. The magnolia tree in the backyard, which hadn't bloomed properly in years, suddenly burst into color. Pale pink blossoms blanketed the grass like confetti from a celebration no one planned, but that felt well earned. I opened all the windows for the first time in months. The house sighed with me. For the first time in years, I felt like it wasn't just my home, it was my sanctuary again. Anthony began visiting more regularly. Not always with Lily. Sometimes just him in work clothes, hands smudged with soil or paint. I figured the shutters could use a fresh coat, he'd say, or thought I'd clean out the gutters. But I knew what he was really doing. He was reclaiming something, not the house, his place in it. He brought over a photo album one weekend, one I hadn't seen in decades. Inside were images from our last true family Christmas before Henry passed, before the silences, before the shift. Julie was in them, of course, laughing, holding Lily as a baby, dressed in red velvet and pearls. I almost forgot. Anthony said, thumbing through the pages, that it was ever good. Because it wasn't all bad, I said. Not everything that ends was a mistake. He nodded slowly. I just wish I'd seen what she was doing before it went so far. Regret, I said gently, is just a form of remembering with bruises. We sat in quiet for a long time after that. Not as mother and son, but as two people learning how to return to each other through the cracks. He asked me then what I planned to do with the rest of the house when I was gone. Would you want it to stay in the family? He asked. Even if Lily never moves in? Yes, I said without hesitation. But not for nostalgia, for purpose. I pulled out the copy of the restated trust and handed it to him. There's a clause now, I said, that allows the house to become a community memory site if no family member wants it. For storytelling, for history, for quiet. Anthony smiled. Only you would turn your house into a museum. Only you would think that's a bad thing. He laughed a real deep laugh that I hadn't heard in years. And in that moment I felt it again, that old pulse of motherhood. That ache of pride and fear tangled into one unshakable thread. I remembered when he was 5 and fell off his bike. I'd held him close, kissed the gravel from his cheek, and whispered, "You're still strong. That didn't take anything from you." Now sitting beside me was the man that boy had become. Not flawless, but learning, trying. He helped me scan the old photos and upload them into a digital archive. We added voice notes, my stories about each image, so Lily could one day hear them directly from me. We labeled the folder, Truth in Brick and Bone, the story of this house. As we worked, I noticed a shift in him. He no longer moved with guilt. He moved with intent, with care, with clarity. Julie had wanted to inherit power, but Anthony was beginning to inherit responsibility. And that at last was something worthy of the house. Before he left that evening, he paused at the doorway. "Mom," he said, "if I had just asked about the house, about the trust, you would have told me everything, wouldn't you?" "I was always waiting for you to ask," I replied. "But you listened to her instead." He swallowed, nodded. "I'm listening now." And with that, he was gone. But the house stayed. Always the house. Not just full of stories, full of lessons. That sometimes the strongest foundations aren't made of cement. They're made of truth, quiet, firm, and impossible to forge. Spring deepened into summer, and with it came the heat. Not just of weather, but of reflection. I found myself waking earlier each day before the sun scorched the garden. I'd tie back my thinning hair, slip on my gloves, and tend to the roses as I always had. Except now, every cut, every turn of soil, every gentle watering felt layered with meaning. This wasn't just caretaking anymore, it was stewardship. Anthony and Lily visited often. Sometimes Lily brought a friend. The kitchen, once quiet and echoing, now hummed again with chatter and laughter. Their presence wasn't an invasion, it was a return. A kind of healing the house hadn't known in years. And yet, beneath the surface of our renewal, another letter arrived. This one wasn't handwritten, it was official, cold. From the county clerk's office. Julie had filed a Freedom of Information request to access all historical property records tied to the house, likely hoping to find something, anything she could twist. I stared at the letter for a long while. I had won. She knew that. And still she wouldn't let it go. It wasn't about the house anymore. It was about pride. Some people would rather suffocate in resentment than breathe in acceptance. But I knew how to breathe. I'd learned how to inhale even through the smoke of betrayal. I called Mabel at the county office. She has a right to request the records, she told me. But she won't find anything. You know that? I do, I said. But I also know what it's like to fight ghosts. She's not your ghost, Edith. You're hers. The weight of that truth settled into my chest. Julie wasn't trying to reclaim the house. She was trying to reclaim power. But there was none left for her here. Not anymore. I considered reaching out one final olive branch. But then I remembered the last branch I'd extended. It was stripped, ignored, and tossed aside. Some bridges collapse the moment you walk across them. Others were never bridges at all, just painted scenery. So I let the letter go. I filed it. And then I baked a peach cobbler. Because sometimes the best way to reply to provocation is with joy. That Sunday, Anthony and Lily came for dinner. Lily wore a ribbon in her hair and carried a binder full of drawings. "This one's your house," she said, pointing proudly to a bright red rectangle with curly smoke and sunflowers. "And this one's your chair, the one with the flowers." "You captured it perfectly," I said. She pointed to the window she'd drawn. "And that's where you sit and write stories." It stopped me, because it was true. She saw me, not as an old woman, not as a relic, but as a storyteller, a protector, a presence. After dinner, Anthony and I sat on the porch as the sun began to dip. Crickets stirred in the hedges. The evening cooled the air just enough to forget the heat of the day. "I heard from Julie," he said quietly. I didn't respond. She wanted to know if I'd ever forgive her. If Lily would. "And what did you say?" I told her forgiveness isn't a door you can demand to be opened. It's a key you have to earn, and sometimes the door isn't even yours anymore. I looked at him, surprised. He met my gaze. "I'm not the man I used to be, Mom." "No," I said. "You're finally becoming the one your father and I hoped you'd be." He took a deep breath. "I want Lily to remember this house not for the fight, but for the strength." "For you." "She already does," I said. And I believed it. Later that night, I found Lily's drawing still sitting on the side table. On the back of it, in her looping, careful handwriting, was one sentence. "My grandma taught me how to stay." And there it was. Everything I had fought for. Not in court filings or notarized clauses, but in the quiet echo of a child's pencil. A truth more powerful than any document. Summer gave way to golden September, and with it came a feeling I hadn't expected: readiness. Not to leave, but to let go of the burden I had carried so long. The fear that all I had built would crumble the moment I stepped aside. That fear had haunted me more than Julie ever could. It was the quiet question that lingered in the back of my mind even after I filed the final paperwork, even after the apologies, the visits, the closure. Would the house remain my house in spirit, not just in deed? And now, for the first time in years, I knew the answer. Yes, because something had shifted. Not in the title, but in the people. Anthony had stopped asking permission to visit. He just came, fixed things, mended things, sat with me in comfortable silence. And Lily, she'd made a habit of staying the night every other Saturday. We had developed our own little rituals: pancakes in the morning, crossword puzzles in the afternoon, her helping me water the garden in the fading light. She had even begun asking questions I'd long waited to hear. Grandma, who built this room first? Why are there two different kinds of tile in the hallway? Can you teach me how to use the typewriter? I told her everything, showed her old receipts, letters, and even blueprints from when my father had laid the foundation in the early 50s. You mean he drew this house? She asked, wide-eyed. No, sweet girl, I said. He imagined it first. Then he built it. That's what makes it powerful. She nodded solemnly, as if tucking the wisdom into a safe place in her heart. And then one evening, something extraordinary happened. Lily asked if she could record me. Like your podcast, she said, but just for me. We sat in the living room floor lamp casting a soft halo across the carpet, and she held my old phone like a reporter. Okay, Grandma, she said, tell me the story of the house. But start with the part where someone tried to take it. I smiled, not from bitterness but from recognition. She wasn't afraid of the hard parts. She wanted the whole truth. So I told her. I told her about Julie, about the realtor, the forged documents, about the clause my father left like a match in a box waiting for the moment I'd need to strike it. I told her how silence can be a form of strength and how dignity isn't weakness, it's restraint. She listened to every word, and when I was done she looked at me, eyes glassy, and said, I won't let them forget Grandma. Ever? I reached out, cupped her face in my hands. I know, I whispered. She would be the next guardian. Not because of blood, but because of understanding. A week later, Anthony returned with a gift. It was an oak plaque carved with an inscription in gold leaf. This house was never just a house. It was a promise. He hung it just above the mantel, where Julie's modern art once tried to erase the past. And as I looked at it, glowing in the flicker of firelight, I felt something I hadn't known I was waiting for. Not victory, not closure, but continuity. The thing I feared most, being forgotten, being erased, being pushed aside, had not only failed to happen, it had reversed. I was remembered. The woman they once tried to remove had become the anchor. The house was not mine because my name was on the deed. It was mine because my story was etched into the beams. Every creak, every stain, every notch in the banister told it. That night I wrote one final letter, not to Anthony, not to Lily, not even to Julie, to the house. You have held me, tested me, protected me. You watched me grieve, grow, fall, and rise. I gave you my life, and you gave me my legacy. When they tried to sell you, they didn't realize. It wasn't you they were losing. It was me. And I remained. I folded the letter and tucked it behind the old baseboard in the hallway, the same one Anthony carved as a boy. One day someone will find it, and they'll know. This place didn't just shelter a woman, it witnessed her. The last warm day of the year arrived unannounced. It was the kind of crisp October afternoon that glows gold around the edges, where the air smells like fading leaves and old wood, and every shadow stretches a little longer, like the house is exhaling after a long summer. I opened all the windows, let it breathe with me. The silence inside wasn't heavy anymore. It was sacred. A kind of hush that falls over a room where something important just happened. That morning, I made tea in my favorite porcelain cup, the one with the tiny crack near the handle. I sat in the same chair Julie once told me was too worn to keep, and watched the sunlight trace its way across the floor, like it always had, faithful and slow. I had no more enemies in this house, not even ghosts, only the truth living quietly in the walls. And so I did something I'd promised myself I would do the moment all of it ended. I invited Ryan and Marisol, the young couple across the street, over for dinner. Nothing fancy, just pot roast garlic potatoes and my mother's green bean casserole. The recipe was older than any of us, passed down in smudged handwriting and memory. When they arrived, their eyes lit up. It smells like our childhoods. Marisol laughed. Good, I said. That's the point. We ate. We talked. I told stories they didn't expect. About how I almost left once in the 80s when grief swallowed me whole. About how Henry used to dance with me in the hallway when he thought no one was looking. About the time Anthony flooded the garage because he thought the hose could fill a swimming pool. When dessert came, peach cobbler again, this time with vanilla ice cream, I made my offer. I've added a clause to the family trust, I said quietly. If Lily declines to live here one day, I want the house to go to someone who will keep it alive, not as a project, as a promise. They both stared at me. I don't mean now, I added with a smile. I mean someday, when the house is ready, when you are. Ryan reached for Marisol's hand, and I saw in their eyes the same reverence I'd once seen in Henry's when we first moved in. They understood. When they left, Marisol hugged me tightly. We won't forget, she said. I know, I whispered back. Later that evening, Anthony and Lily came by. No reason, just a visit. Lily brought me a tiny hand-bound book she'd made in school titled, Things Grandma Taught Me. Inside on the first page in uneven letters it read, You can protect something without hurting anyone. You can be strong without shouting. You can stay, even when they tell you to leave. I couldn't speak, so I just held her close. As night fell, I stood once more in the doorway of the house, gazing out into the street, into the stars beginning to pierce the dark. Julie hadn't been seen in months. I didn't know where she lived now. I didn't ask. I didn't need to. Some chapters don't need epilogues. They just need endings. And this one, it ended exactly where it began, with a woman, in her home, owning everything they said she didn't understand. There are stories we tell the world, and then there are stories we live quietly, word by word, in the space between breath and memory. Mine was not loud. It was not glamorous, but it was true. They tried to erase me with paperwork, with confidence, with the condescending assumption that age equals irrelevance. But they forgot one thing. Old houses, like old women, are built to last. And we remember everything. Julie thought she could list this house on a spreadsheet and write me out of it like a footnote. What she didn't know is that I was the footnote, and the title, and the last signature on the final page. Now, when Lily runs through the hallway, I hear not just her laughter, but the echo of my own childhood, my father's footsteps, Henry's quiet hum as he built the bookshelf that still stands. This house is full, not just of things, of meaning. And I'm not just a woman who stayed, I'm a woman who endured, a woman who made silence into a sword. So if anyone ever tells you that your place is in the past, smile and remind them, the past is where all the power lives, and sometimes it holds the deed.